Greetings, peeps on the interwebs, Jake here. So I'm going to try something new here with this video. Let me just preface by saying that big Lord of the Rings fan. It's my favorite book series, favorite movie series, and even though I've done reviews on the Rings of Power series and the War of the Hero movie, I've never really done, Lord of the Rings specific videos in terms of, lore or anything like that, because there's a lot of channels that do that way better than I ever can. But I'm going to try my hand at it, and kind of my own take. So basically, as you can tell by the title of this video, is I'm kind of proposing, does Gimli have the best arc out of the members of the Fellowship? And, obviously all the characters gotta go through their own adventures, their own arcs, have their own stories and all that stuff. But to me, I think Gimli has perhaps the best arc out of all of them. Simply because, and I'm also going to be using examples from both the books and the movies, probably more so the movies, just because I imagine the people who are going to end up watching this video will be a bit more familiar with the movies than the books. But anyways, so when we first meet Gimli in both the books and the movies, it's at the Council of Elrond. And basically, he is very much, once you're kind of discussing what to do with the ring, he is very much like anti-elf. He, in the movie, he says, he'd rather die than see the ring in the hands of an elf. And, granted, so, without going into the whole thousands upon thousands of years of distrust and beef that the elves and dwarves have had in Middle-earth, suffice to say, they just haven't gotten on that well, and obviously this has continued through Gimli and Legolas kind of butting heads. Now, obviously they eventually kind of level out a little bit and decide to join Frodo on this quest, both movies and book version. Now, one thing that I do like, I'm also gonna, there'll also be a little bit of a Gimli appreciation video as well, because obviously he's a popular character, but I think more so movies than books, but maybe even to a lesser extent the books, but mostly the movies. I feel like Gimli doesn't get nearly as much appreciation or, praise, or people, kind of think him as cool as Legolas, just because we get to see Legolas do a lot more cool things. Which I guess a little side tangent. I think the main reason why Legolas does so many cool things in the movies is because, honestly, in the books, he doesn't do a whole lot. But, anyways, back to the main point. So, yes, this will be both me telling why I think Gimli has the best arc, and also a little bit of a Gimli appreciation post. So, anyways, all that out of the way. One thing that I do like in the movie, that wasn't in the book, but I still think is in line with the character of Gimli, and just how, resilient and honestly kind of pure Gimli is, because, once they're kind of deciding what to, once they decide they have to destroy the ring, Gimli is the first one, steps up, takes his axe, and just says, what are we waiting for, and cleaves into the ring. Now, obviously, I think for the movie, they just had to show that, without, obviously Elrond says that, no weapon we hear possessed can damage the ring, but I think that was also meant to just kind of further showcase to the audience, especially those who haven't read the books, that, you can't just, smash it or chop it in half or anything like that. You literally have to toss into to Mount Doom to destroy it. But I still love that moment for Gimli, because it is very much in line with the character, where he's a bit more stoic in the books compared to the movies. But he is this kind of almost no-nonsense, kind of okay, what needs to be done? Let's go do it. And so I love that moment for him in the movies, even though it's not in the books. But, so, throughout the first bit of the Fellowship's journey, Legolas and Gimli are kind of, again, they're tolerating each other, but they're still not really getting along, necessarily, or being as cordial as the other Fellowship members have. Because gradually they all kind of start to, see each other's, strengths and weaknesses and all that stuff. But one of my favorite scenes in the Fellowship, but kind of before we get into the arc bit, is I love when they're in Balin's tomb, and they bar the door shut because the orcs are coming, and I just love that Gimli hops atop Balin's tomb, draws his axes, and says, "Let them come. There's still one dwarf who yet draws breath in Moria." Love that line. Probably my favorite Gimli line in the entire trilogy. But so, they go through the mines of Moria, and, obviously they lose Gandalf in the process, and then that's when they get to Lothlorien. Now, here's where the arc really starts to sink in. So again, and I do like that because I don't recall in the books if Gimli says something to this effect, but I do like that in the movies. As they're entering the woods of Lothlorien, Gimli says that there's a witch that supposedly lives in the woods and she'll cast a spell on people, and that anyone who enters the woods never returns, which I think is actually more or less what Eomer says in the Two Towers, but I'll get to that later. And then, of course, that's when they're ensnared by the Elves of Lothlorien. And I also... So, this is the extended cut of the Fellowship, so if you haven't seen the extended cut, would highly recommend all the movies, because the extended cut Lord of the Rings trilogy is the best, and I'm spoiled to it. So basically, once they are kind of talking to Haldir, and he kind of reluctantly agrees to take them to see Galadriel, or right before then, Gimli says, "Oh, so much for the hospitality of the elves." Again, being very anti-elf. And Haldir says, we haven't had dealings with dwarves since the Dark Days, and I forget the exact quote that he says. I believe in Khuzdul. I could be wrong, but it sounds more like Khuzdul than it does Elvish. But basically, what Gimli says is, "I spit on your grave," to Haldir's response, which is pretty, that's pretty savage, and also damn, that's pretty hardcore to just tell him I spit on your grave. So again, still at this point, even though him and Legolas are kinda starting to get along a little bit more, he's still very anti-elf. However, once Gimli and the rest of the Fellowship have stayed in Lorien for a few days to kind of recuperate after the loss of Gandalf, and also just all the things they've been through since they left Rivendell. And Gimli meets Galadriel, he then basically just becomes completely enamored with her. Not in a romantic way, but just he realizes just how ethereal and beautiful Galadriel is, and basically sees that, okay, yes, she is probably the most beautiful thing in all of Middle-earth. And probably the best scene to exemplify this, in both the books and the movies, is, and I don't remember if this is in the theatrical cut because it's been so long since I've seen them, but I know it's in the extended cut. So basically, when Galadriel is giving everybody their gifts, she asks Gimli, and what would you ask of the elves? And initially, he's kind of bashful, and he's kind of it's nothing, I don't need anything. But then he says, well, actually, there's one thing. And so, of course, she's kind of yeah, ask it, whatever you want. And he says, if only I could have a strand of your hair, or some, I forget the exact verbiage, but basically he's asking for a strand of her hair. So, before I go forward, I need to go back to give a little bit context and why this is so important. So, First Age, there's a dude named Feanor. He was an elf and the greatest craftsman in all of Middle-earth. Forged the Silmarils, which, that's a whole other thing that I won't go into, but basically the Silmarils are the most magnificent creations just ever created. And when Feanor is crafting them, he asks Galadriel, who is his niece, for a strand of her hair. Because basically her hair, it was said to have captured the light of the two trees, which that's a whole other thing. But basically the two trees, that was the light source in Middle-earth before the sun and the moon were created, which that's a whole other... I'm not going to go into a lot of the lore, because otherwise this will probably be a 5-hour-long video. I can explore these in future videos if you all like this one enough, but all that to say. So basically her hair, her beautiful golden blonde hair, was said to have traces of the light of the trees of Valinor in her hair. And so Feanor, as he was crafting the greatest jewels, asked her 3 times, and she refused them all 3 times. Not necessarily because, she just was being a jerk about it, but because she kind of saw that Feanor wasn't wanting her hair out of admiration, but more as just, oh, that'd be a nice ingredient for my thing that I'm working on. And kind of saw that there was a bit of, not evil in his heart, but definitely not the best intentions, and there was a bit of darkness in there. And again, Feanor, that's a whole can of worms that I'm not going to go into. So basically, and also, when Gimli asks for a strand of her hair, she asks, all the elves around her are kind of murmuring. They're just kind of what? This dwarf is asking for her hair? What? This dude's crazy. But I like that, Galadriel asks, what would you do with this gift? And, Gimli basically says, I would treasure it. Like, like if I survive this whole perilous quest, I'm going to go back home and I'm going to basically put this in imperishable crystal, so that way it'll be an heirloom of my house, and it'll survive until the end of time. And so that is this incredibly beautiful moment, because this is two characters kind of helping mend this long standing feud and beef that the elves and dwarf have had with each other over, like, again, thousands and thousands of years. And so it's Galadriel kind of sees the purity in Gimli's request. He's not asking for her hair in for the same reasons that Feanor was, where he's just kind of like, aha, I will make this into some great thing of, he's wanting to cherish that, and basically, even I think he even says the effect that, like, to help kind of, again, mend the relationship between the elves and dwarves. And so what she does is she gives him 3 strands. And I love in the movie, when they're selling down the Anduin and Legolas asks Gimli, what did she give you? And he says, 3, he says, I asked for a single strand of her hair and she gave me 3. And I love the look on Legolas's face, because he likely knows the significance of that. And also in the book, this is when Legolas and Gimli really start to kind of be buddy-buddy. And so that, I'm sure for people who haven't read the books or know, like, a whole lot about, like, the extended lore and stuff like that, it seems like an odd thing. It maybe doesn't have as much significance, but it truly is this incredibly beautiful moment between, these two characters, very strong characters, and again, just the mending of these relationships between, elves and dwarves. And then that continues with Legolas and Gimli. And one of the best examples is in the Two Towers book and movie, when, they see the Battle of Helm's Deep, and, they have their killing contest. Which I think is initially kind of them, even though they're at this point they're pretty friendly with each other, but I think this is still that kind of, like, dwarf-elvish rivalry, still there, still prevalent, even though they've become pretty friendly at this point. Well, actually, let me flash back towards the whole before that. So when they first arrive in Rohan, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, they're actually, they're surrounded by the riders of Rohan, led by Éomer, and once Éomer, they tell him that they came from Lothlorien. I love that, Éomer basically says more or less the effect of what Gimli said in the Fellowship movie. He's kind of like, oh, you all came from Lothlorien? Like, there's said to be, like, a witch there that casts spells on people and they're never seen. And Gimli basically is just, he's ready to throw down with Éomer. He's kind of like, you shut your whore mouth, and I'm going to fight you if you say any more bad things about, my lady Galadriel. And Éomer's just kind of like, oh, okay, sorry, bro. My apologies. Maybe she's nice. But again, just showing that, like, in that short time that Gimli spent in Lothlorien and talking to Galadriel, he's basically ready to, like, fight, give his life up to defend her and her name. So then we, flash forward back to the Battle of Helm's Deep, and this is where I'm going to show a bit of appreciation, because even though everybody knows that Gimli won, because he got 42, killed 42 Uruk-hai, and Legolas killed 41. This really goes to show how skilled of a warrior that Gimli is. Because Legolas, he's got a bow, so he's got the advantage in this battle, especially, up until the walls are breached of Helm's Deep. Not a lot of the Uruk-hai are scaling the walls. That's the only chance that Gimli has to actually get any kills in. Legolas is safely on top of the walls, at a safe distance with his bow, and yet Gimli still managed to beat him. So, again, a lot of people don't really, I guess, pay enough attention to the fact that, like, also, further proving that he's such a good warrior is, so Gimli, being a dwarf, is a lot shorter than the Uruk-hai, because Uruk-hai, they're much taller and broader, and a lot of them are, at least in the movies, I don't remember if the books specify what kind of weapons they're using, a little bit of everything if I recall, but a lot of the Uruk-hai we see in the movies, they're wielding, like, long swords, there's, spears, halberds, pikes, all that stuff, so weapons with range, whereas Gimli's got an axe, so not as much range as, say, a sword or, obviously, a spear, anything like that. Yet he still managed to get in close range combat to 42 Orkai and slay each and every one of them. So just let that sink in, that a dude who's, a fraction of the size of the Orkai and Legolas, and all the men at Helm's Deep, got the most kills. And so, obviously after that, then that's when Legolas, I think, gets even more respect for Gimli, and their bond starts to really grow even further. And then, of course, we go to the Return of the King, and also again, there are moments that I'm kind of missing, but I'm kind of hitting like a lot of the highlights here, because otherwise this would be a much longer video. And I'm trying to keep this relatively short, and also prevent myself from rambling too much. So I flash forward to the Return of the King, and again, I don't believe this was in the books, but it's been several years since I read the book, so I could be wrong. But even so, I love the line when the hosts of the West are at the Black Gates, and Gimli looks up to Legolas and says, I never thought I'd die fighting by side with an elf. And then Legolas says, how about dying side by side with a friend? And of course, Gimli's like, yeah, I could do that. And that's just such a pure, beautiful, incredible moment of these two and how much they've progressed. But again, in particular Gimli, where we first get introduced to him, he is so anti-elf that it's almost like he goes on this mission kind of out of spite, because he's kind of like, nah, I gotta represent my people, and I gotta make sure that elf doesn't get that ring for whatever reason. But I love that moment so much in the movie. And then, of course, in the books, so basically after the War of the Ring, so during their adventures, when they go to Fangorn Forest, and then actually during the Battle of Helm's Deep, Gimli goes into the Glittering Caves, which is basically the cave system we see in the movie, the two towers, like where a lot of the women and children are held, like kind of hiding out. So basically, when Gimli sees the Glittering Caves, I forget where Legolas is at this point, but basically he describes the Glittering Caves to Legolas, and Legolas is even kind of taken aback about how elegant Gimli is with describing the Glittering Caves. And basically they kind of make an agreement that's, they're like, hey, so if we survive this whole ordeal, Legolas is like, all right, you have to come to Fangorn with me. We're going to go, hang out with the Ents and just travel through the beautiful forest, and then I'll go to the Glittering Caves with you. Because neither one were, like, Legolas, I think, is more intrigued to see the Glittering Caves, just of how, the way Gimli described it. Gimli's not so pumped to go to the Fangorn, just because, like, the Ents and Dwarves are almost kind of, like, fundamentally opposed with one another, just due to their backgrounds, which I'm not going to go into, because that'll just lead into a whole other tangent. But basically, he's not too thrilled to go into Fangorn, but again, he's kind of like, alright, cool, no problem, you've agreed to come with me into the Glittering Caves. And sure enough, after the War of the Ring, on their return home, Legolas and Gimli go to the Glittering Caves, and Legolas is apparently, he's kind of like, I've got no words, but Gimli described it perfectly. Now, we don't get Gimli's reaction to the Fangorn Forest, but presumably probably something similar. And it makes sense just because, dwarves living underground would probably have a better way to, like, kind of more poetically describe, like, the beauty of, the subterranean world, whereas elves living above ground and in forests would have a better way of describing forests and the beauty of them. And then, of course, after, basically, like, Gimli ends up establishing his own, like, colony in the Glittering Caves. Legolas ends up establishing his own colony in Ithilien, which is a portion of Gondor. And so that way they're still relatively close, even though they're now kind of lords of their own dominions. They're still pretty close to each other and visited pretty frequently. And then after, this is the Fourth Age, so they're the last two Fellowship members still alive at this point. And Legolas finally sails west to the Undying Lands, or Valinor, because that's typically where elves would go, usually towards the end of their lives when they kind of... that... Basically, like, they would sail west, because that's just kind of where their home was, more or less. That's probably the easiest simplest way to describe it without again going into the whole like deep lore dive on the elves and all that stuff. Um, and so basically, Gimli goes with them. Now again, the significance of this is so basically Valinor is only meant for the elves. So once the elves either die, they're re-embodied and can live for the rest of their new lives in Valinor, or if they have not died, then they sail west and just basically live at peace. However, because of not only Gimli's contributions in the War of the Ring, but also because of his just deep devotion and friendship to Legolas and also to Galadriel, he's basically permitted to go to Valinor. So he's the only dwarf that gets to go to Valinor. And because of the friendship that he and Legolas established over hundreds of years, by the time that they sail west, and to me, I think that's also basically where the Tolkien kind of describes like that's the end of the Fellowship. Once they sail west, then that's the end. But I think that's what really perfectly encapsulates Gimli's arc, is from where he begins, very anti-elf, to the very end, he's sailing with his best buddy to the west to basically live out the remainder of his days with the elves. And that's why I think he, in my opinion, has the best arc. Not to take anything away from the other characters' arcs, but I think that to me is the most, I don't know, it's very, very humbling, very beautiful, and yeah, it's just a phenomenal arc for any character. But that's definitely why I think Gimli has the best like full arc out of any other character in the Lord of the Rings books and movies. Like even got a little emotional there because it's awesome. And again, Lord of the Rings that's basically my religion. So, but yeah, so that more or less wraps up my still relatively rambly video as my typical fashion on why I think Gimli has the best arc. And again, I'm sure I know for a fact there are videos that have probably done a way better job explaining like the significance of like all that stuff and why Gimli has maybe the better arc or just the significance of those two, their friendship and all that stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I just kind of wanted to try this, see how it goes. So leave comments below if you like this, if you'd like to see more like lore videos about Lord of the Rings or whatever, or if this is terrible and never do it again. And also, if you did like this video, let me know if you agree with me that you think Gimli had the best arc, or do you think another character in the movies/books had a better arc? Let's discuss below. And until next time, everyone, cheers.